Montana, the autumn of 1947. The valley was a slash of gold and brown, bracing for the inevitable white. Men were splitting wood, their axes ringing with a frantic rhythm against the shortening days. They were chinking walls, banking foundations with earth, preparing for the siege of winter, and they were watching the widow. Her name was Elara Vance. She was a slight woman, made smaller by the vastness of the landscape and the even larger shadow of her recent loss. She was building on the small plot her husband had bought before shipping out, a place he would never see. But it wasn't what she was building that drew the whispers and the slow, pitying shakes of the head. It was how she was building it. She had assembled the Quonset hut herself, with the help of 2 hired boys, still too young to have fought in the war. The structure rose from the prairie like a long silver beetle, a piece of the modern world dropped into the timeless valley. The neighbors understood that part. Surplus was cheap. But then came the strangeness. She began constructing a second, larger frame of rough-sawn pine around the first, leaving a wide, deliberate gap of nearly 2 feet between the metal shell and the new wooden skeleton. Then, day after day, she hauled wagon loads of dry hay from her small field, not for livestock, but for her house. She began packing it meticulously into the cavity she had created. The men at the general store called it Vance's Folly. Some, more cruelly, called it the tinderbox. They saw a woman, addled by grief, building her own funeral pyre. What did this quiet widow, a former city dweller from the East, understand about the killing cold of a Montana winter that every seasoned rancher and builder had somehow missed? Subscribe to this channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. To understand her supposed folly, you first have to understand the enemy. Winter in this part of the world was not a season. It was a predator. It stalked the valleys on winds that carried the chill of the Arctic Circle. It was a physical presence that found every crack, every nail hole, every weakness in a man's defense. The cold was a thief that stole heat with terrifying efficiency. It leached warmth through the thickest logs, turning the inside of a cabin wall into a weeping sheet of frost. It made a cast-iron stove, glowing cherry red, seem like a flickering candle in a cathedral of ice. A family's survival was measured in cords of wood, and the pile, no matter how large in October, always seemed terrifyingly small by February. The suffering was a quiet, intimate thing. It was the ache in your bones that never left. It was children bundled in so many layers they could barely move, their breath pluming in the air of their own homes. It was the constant, gnawing anxiety of the woodpile, the fear of a sudden blizzard that could trap you for weeks, the dread of a sickness when the doctor was a day's ride away, if the roads were even passable. Ink froze in its wells. Water barrels had to be shattered with an axe each morning. Life contracted to the few feet of warmth around the stove. The conventional wisdom for fighting this enemy was mass. The settlers built with what they had and what they knew. They erected log cabins with walls a foot thick or timber frame houses with heavy planking. The idea was simple. Put as much solid material as possible between your family and the cold. A thick wall held the heat longer. It was a fortress. It was what had worked for generations. But it was a flawed strategy. A log wall, for all its bulk, was still a conductor of heat. The cold would slowly, relentlessly soak through the wood, and once the mass was cold, it took an immense amount of energy to warm it back up. The houses were drafty, leaky vessels in a sea of cold, kept habitable only by the constant, furious burning of fuel. They were fighting a war of attrition against the second law of thermodynamics, and they were barely holding their ground. Elara Vance had come to this valley with a different kind of knowledge. Her husband, David, had not been a farmer or a builder. He had been an engineer, one of the thousands of bright young men tasked with keeping bomber crews alive at 30,000 feet. He had spent the war fighting not just the enemy, but the brutal, lethal cold of the stratosphere. In their letters, and in his brief times home, he hadn't talked of combat. He had talked of physics. He explained to Elara how a thin aluminum skin flying through air that was 60 degrees below zero could be made survivable. He spoke of the principles not as abstract science, but as a matter of life and death. He told her that solid mass was a fool's game in the sky. The real enemy was air movement, convection. The secret was to trap air, to make it hold still. Still air, he'd explained, was one of the most effective insulators in existence. He talked about the layers they used in flight jackets, the vacuum of a thermos bottle, the importance of stopping the tiniest drafts. He had taught her that you don't fight the cold with brute force. You trick it, you manage it, you build a bubble of stillness and let the laws of nature work for you, not against you. When he was gone, his words remained. Looking at the Quonset hut, she didn't see a cheap piece of surplus. She saw the fuselage of a B-17. She saw a problem of physics she knew how to solve. The build began in late summer, a race against the first snow. First, the foundation. It was a simple concrete slab, but she insisted the hired boys dig a deep trench around its perimeter, which she filled with rocks and then a thick layer of tar. A crude but effective thermal break to stop the ground frost from creeping under her floor. This was the first oddity the neighbors noted. Then came the Quonset itself. The corrugated steel panels went up quickly, bolted together into their iconic arch. For a week, it looked like a normal, if somewhat unusual, new homestead. Then the lumber arrived. She laid out the design for the outer frame herself, using chalk lines on the ground. It was a simple post and beam structure. A larger ghost of the hut it surrounded. The uprights were spaced 4 feet apart, connected by horizontal girts. It was flimsy, over-engineered for a simple shed wall, but perfectly suited for its true purpose, to create a uniform, precisely measured void. The gap was 18 inches. No more, no less. This precision confused the onlookers. Why not just build a bigger shed? Marcus Thorne arrived on a crisp September afternoon. He was the valley's undisputed master builder. He had raised nearly every significant structure for 20 miles around, from stout barns that withstood the wind to a church whose steeple was a local landmark. He was a man whose knowledge was practical, earned through decades of hard winters and the occasional instructive failure. He was not unkind, but he was direct. He walked around the strange double-walled structure, his eyes taking in every detail. He watched Elara for a long moment as she methodically began sheathing the outer frame with rough pine boards. He finally approached, taking off his hat as a sign of respect. "Afternoon, Mysterious Vance," he began, his voice a low rumble. "I don't mean to pry, but I feel it's my duty to ask what you're intending here." Elara paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her glove. "I'm building my home, Mr. Thorne." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the 18-inch gap. "I see that, but this... hay." He gestured to the neat stacks she had already prepared. "Ma'am, that hay is going to settle. It will get damp from the snow, and it will rot your outer walls from the inside out. But that's the least of your worries." He stepped closer, pointing a thick, calloused finger at the gleaming metal of the Quonset. "This steel is going to get ice cold. Any warmth from your stove, any moisture from your breath, is going to hit this metal and condense. It'll turn to frost, then ice. That ice will melt in the day, run down into your hay, and by nightfall, you'll have a solid wall of ice packed around your home. It won't insulate you. It will refrigerate you, I've seen it happen in barns." His argument was sound. It was based on experience. It was technically precise and entirely logical. Any other person in the valley would have recognized the wisdom in his words. Elara listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she simply said, "The hay won't get wet, Mr. Thorne. I have a vapor barrier." He looked at her, baffled. He had expected an argument or tears, or a confession of ignorance. He did not expect quiet, unshakable confidence. He tried again. "And the fire risk? A stray spark from that chimney? This whole thing will go up like a torch." "The chimney is triple-walled and packed with rock wool, just like on a ship," she replied, her tone even. "It will be quite safe." Thorne put his hat back on. He had done his duty. He had offered the best advice he had, and it had been politely ignored. "As you wish, ma'am," he said, the warmth gone from his voice. "I hope for your boy's sake, you know what you're doing." He turned and walked away, the set of his shoulders communicating a grim certainty of disaster. His visit solidified the community's opinion. If Marcus Thorne said it was a death trap, then it was a death trap. The name Vance's Folly became permanent. The mockery wasn't loud or overt, but it was constant. It was in the way men would stop talking when she entered the store, the pitying glances from the women at church. She was the foolish widow, building a nest for mice and a tomb for herself and her son. She ignored it all. She worked from sunup to sundown, her small son playing nearby in the dirt. She finished the outer sheathing, then applied a layer of tar paper over it for weatherproofing. The most crucial step came last. Before packing the hay, she meticulously lined the entire interior of the outer wooden wall with more tar paper. This was her defense against Thorne's primary objection: ambient moisture from outside. Then came the hay. It wasn't just dumped in. She packed it by hand, using a long pole to ensure a consistent density. Not too tight, which would allow for heat conduction through the fibers themselves. Not too loose, which would allow air to circulate and form convection currents. She was tuning the space, creating a matrix of millions of tiny, trapped air pockets. When it was done, the house looked almost normal from the outside. It was a long, barn-shaped building with pine siding. Only the curved roofline hinted at the metal secret within. But Elara had not built a house. She had built a system. She had built a machine for capturing and holding heat. The physics were elegant. The small wood stove inside would heat the air in the Quonset hut. The curved metal walls, being highly conductive, would warm up almost instantly, radiating that heat outwards like a giant, gentle oven element. This wave of thermal energy would travel into the 18-inch cavity. There it would be met by the hay. But the hay was just a cage. The real insulator was the vast volume of air trapped within its fibers. This enormous, static cushion of air would slow the transfer of heat to a crawl. The outer wooden wall, protected from the interior heat by the insulation and from the exterior elements by tar paper, would remain close to the ambient outside temperature. It was a fortress not of mass, but of air. It was a thermos bottle you could live in. By late October, she was finished. The first snows had already dusted the high peaks. The valley held its breath. The men looked at their wood piles, then at the strange, long house on the Vance plot, and they shook their heads. The winter would be the judge. December arrived with a cold, clear snap. The temperature hovered in the teens during the day and dropped to single digits at night. It was a normal start to a Montana winter. The community began its annual hibernation. Smoke rose thick and steady from every chimney, a visible measure of the fuel being consumed to keep the cold at bay. Then, in the second week of January, the real winter came. It arrived not as a storm, but as a silent, invisible invasion from the north. The old-timers called it a Siberian Express, a mass of Arctic air that had swept down across the Canadian plains, unhindered by mountains or oceans. The temperature drop was relentless, almost terrifying in its speed. At dawn on Tuesday, the thermometer outside the general store read 5 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was 10 below zero. The air grew so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, a painful, crystalline thing. The sky was a brilliant, pitiless blue. By Wednesday morning, the reading was -22. And then the wind began. It wasn't a blizzard, not a gale, but a steady, unceasing river of air that flowed out of the northeast at 30 miles per hour. It scoured the landscape, picking up loose snow and blasting it against any obstacle. The wind chill pushed the effective temperature to 50, then 60 degrees below zero. The valley was paralyzed. It was a cold that broke things. Metal became brittle and snapped. Trees exploded with a sound like a rifle shot as the sap inside them froze and expanded. It was a cold that sought death. Inside the homes of the settlers, a desperate battle was being waged. The conventional log and timber houses, which had felt so sturdy in autumn, were hemorrhaging heat. The massive walls, now thoroughly chilled, radiated a deep, penetrating cold. Families abandoned all but one room, hanging blankets over the doorways to create a smaller, defensible space. They fed their stoves constantly. The iron doors were rarely closed, as men shoved split logs into their glowing maws, trying to beat back the encroaching frost. The sound of a man chopping wood in the sub-zero air became a common, desperate punctuation to the howl of the wind. The sound of someone burning through their winter supply at a catastrophic rate. Livestock in the barns began to die, freezing to death where they stood. Wells froze solid, forcing families to melt snow for water, a process that consumed yet more precious firewood. The world had shrunk to the immediate primal needs of warmth and survival. Marcus Thorne was fighting the same battle, but with more resources and a better-built fortress. His home, the product of his life's work, was a masterpiece of log construction, with carefully saddle-notched corners and walls nearly 16 inches thick. It was the warmest, most secure home in the valley. And it was failing. He had stuffed every crack with wool and rags. A thick layer of frost, an inch deep, coated the inside of the window panes. A similar rime of ice grew along the nail heads in the walls, tiny, glittering points where the cold was punching through the wood. He and his wife wore their coats, hats, and gloves indoors. His massive stone fireplace, normally a source of radiant, gentle warmth, was now a ravenous beast. He and his eldest son were hauling wood from the shed every 2 hours, a brutal, lung-searing task in the wind. The woodpile, which he had calculated would last until April, was half gone in 2 days. He felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. His expertise, his lifetime of knowledge, had met its match. His best efforts were not enough. It was on the 3rd night of the cold snap that he thought of Elara Vance. The thought came to him as he watched his wife trying to warm a pot of soup over the stove, her face etched with worry. He imagined the widow and her boy in that metal tube, wrapped in hay. He had predicted it would become a block of ice. In this cold, a cold he had never before experienced, his prediction felt like a death sentence. A wave of guilt washed over him. He had mocked her, albeit quietly. He had stood by, secure in his own knowledge, and watched her build her own tomb. What if her fire had gone out? What if they were already gone? The thought was unbearable. He was the community's elder, its most respected builder. He had a responsibility. "I'm going to check on the widow," he announced, his voice rough. His wife looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "In this? Marcus, you can't. You'll not make it half a mile. I'm taking the sled. "I have to," he said. There was no arguing with the tone in his voice. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and canvas he owned, pulling a fur-lined hat down over his ears and wrapping a scarf around his face until only his eyes were exposed. The journey was only a mile as the crow flies, but tonight it felt like a polar expedition. The moment he stepped outside, the cold was a physical blow. It drove the air from his lungs and stabbed at his exposed skin with 1,000 tiny needles. The wind was a solid wall, trying to push him back. He leaned into it, his boots crunching on snow that had the consistency of sand. He made his way to the small shed where he kept a dog sled and his team of 4 huskies, his only reliable transportation in weather like this. The journey to the Vance homestead was a surreal battle. The wind tore at him, trying to find any gap in his clothing. His breath froze instantly on his scarf, creating a cage of ice around his mouth. The dogs, hardy as they were, whined and strained against the wind. He could feel the cold beginning to penetrate his layers, a deep, ominous chill that was more than just discomfort. It was the first touch of frostbite. He almost turned back twice, but the image of the woman and her son, alone in that flimsy structure, pushed him forward. He felt a growing dread. He was no longer going to check on a neighbor. He was on a rescue mission, one he was likely too late for. After what felt like an hour, he saw it, a long, dark shape against the snow-blasted landscape. Vance's Folly. His heart sank. There was no light in the windows, and most damning of all, there was only the faintest, thinnest wisp of smoke coming from the chimney pipe. In this cold, a healthy fire meant a column of thick, billowing smoke. That thin trail meant a dying fire, embers, the last gasp of warmth before the end. He was too late. He urged the dogs on, pulling the sled right up to the single door. He fumbled with his thick mittens, pulling one off to knock. His bare knuckles on the wood felt like striking stone. The cold was immediate and agonizing. He pounded on the door, shouting her name, his voice swallowed by the wind. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then he heard the sound of a latch being drawn. The door swung inward. It was not the scene of frozen tragedy he had braced himself for. It was a scene of such impossible, shocking domesticity that his mind struggled to process it. The first thing that hit him was the air. It was not a blast of frigid, dead air. It was a wave, a physical wave of warmth, carrying the scent of baking bread and something else, damp wool from his own melting scarf. He stood on the threshold, blinking, stunned into silence. Elara Vance stood before him, holding the door. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Behind her, in the warm, bright light of a single lantern, her young son was on the floor, playing with a set of wooden blocks. He was barefoot. Marcus Thorne's eyes darted around the interior of the Quonset hut, taking in the impossible details. There was no frost on the windows. In fact, he could see tiny beads of condensation at the bottom of the panes, something he hadn't seen in his own home for 3 days. A small pot of water simmered on the little wood stove, letting out a gentle puff of steam. A line was strung across one end of the room, and a few pieces of laundry were hanging from it, drying. They were actually drying. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the raging wind. He felt clumsy and oversized in his heavy winter gear. He started to unwrap the ice-caked scarf from his face, his fingers clumsy with cold. The warmth of the room was so profound, it was almost painful on his chilled skin. "Mr. Thorne?" Elara said, her voice calm, though her eyes showed a flicker of concern at his appearance. "Are you all right? You look frozen through." He couldn't answer. He was the builder. His mind was working, trying to reconcile the reality of this room with the laws of nature as he knew them. He walked past her, his boots leaving clumps of snow on the clean-swept wooden floor. He reached out a trembling, half-numb hand and placed it flat against the curved, corrugated metal of the interior wall. It was warm. Not hot, not even close, but it was distinctly, undeniably warm to the touch. It felt like the wall of a house on a mild autumn day. He pressed his ear against it. He could hear nothing but the faint, steady hum of the wind outside, a distant, powerless monster. His gaze fell on the wood box next to the stove. It was a simple crate, perhaps 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was 3/4 full of split pine. He turned to Elara, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Your fire," he said. "It's so small." "It's all I need," she replied simply. "How much wood?" he asked, the question feeling momentous. "How much have you burned since the cold set in?" She glanced at the wood box, then at the small pile of reserve wood stacked neatly against the far wall. "Oh, I suppose about 1/4 of a cord. Maybe a little less." The numbers landed like a physical blow, 1/4 of a cord in 3 days. He, in his fortress of logs, had burned through nearly a full cord and a half, 6 times as much fuel for a fraction of the comfort. He was fighting a raging battle, and she was living. Paragraph. His eyes scanned the room again and found the thermometer hanging from a nail on the wall. He stepped over to it, his heart pounding. The mercury was a thick, confident red line. It rested on 66 degrees. 66. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the temperature outside was now approaching 30 below zero. He was standing in a room that was nearly 100 degrees warmer than the air just 2 feet away on the other side of a wall made of metal, hay, and pine boards. The numbers were undeniable. The proof was all around him in the barefoot child, the drying laundry, the warm, fragrant air. His entire understanding of his craft, of the world he lived in, had been shattered in the space of 3 minutes. He turned to face Elara Vance. The arrogance, the pity, the certainty were all gone, replaced by a profound and humbling awe. He looked at her, this quiet woman whom the entire valley had dismissed as a fool, and he saw not madness, but a genius that bordered on witchcraft. "I was wrong," he said, the words feeling inadequate but essential. "I was completely and utterly wrong. This is impossible." He took a deep breath, the warm air filling his aching lungs. "You have to teach me," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You have to show me how you did this." When the great cold snap finally broke a week later, it left a ravaged, exhausted valley in its wake. The stories that emerged were grim. Families who had lost all their livestock, men with severe frostbite. 2 trappers who had been caught out on the plains were found frozen solid. Every household was facing a critical shortage of firewood, with 2 long months of winter still to go. But amidst the tales of hardship, a different story began to circulate. It started as a whisper, a rumor too incredible to be believed. It was the story of Marcus Thorne's midnight journey to the widow Vance's place. The story of the warm house. At first, people dismissed it. But Thorne was not a man given to exaggeration. When he began telling the story himself, his voice filled with a convert's zeal, people started to listen. He described the barefoot child, the steaming kettle, the full wood box. He spoke of the thermometer reading 66 degrees. He became the innovation's most powerful and credible champion. The community's perspective shifted with astonishing speed. Pity turned to curiosity, curiosity to respect, and respect to outright awe. Men who had laughed at Vance's folly now walked by the strange, long house with a sense of wonder. They were no longer looking at a tinderbox. They were looking at the future. That spring, a delegation of ranchers, led by Marcus Thorne, approached Elara Vance. They didn't come with advice or warnings. They came with their hats in their hands, asking for her help. Elara, who had never sought recognition, shared her knowledge freely. She explained the principles her husband had taught her, not with complex equations, but with simple analogies. She talked about the way a down-filled blanket works, how still air is the warmest coat of all. She drew diagrams in the dirt, showing them how to build the double wall, how to install the vapor barriers, how to pack the insulation to the correct density. Marcus Thorne was her first and most devoted student. That summer, he built a new barn for his dairy herd, incorporating her design. He built a Quonset shell first, then a larger pole barn structure around it, packing the cavity with straw. The following winter, for the first time in his life, he lost not a single cow to the cold. His milk production actually increased. The economic proof was as stunning as the thermal proof had been. The idea spread like a summer fire. The Vance method, as it came to be known, became the new standard for construction in the valley and the surrounding territories. People adapted it, using sawdust or wood shavings when hay was scarce. They applied the principle to their existing homes, building insulated outer shells around their drafty log cabins. The visual landscape of the valley began to change. Elara Vance never built another house. She remained on her small homestead, raising her son, a quiet, respected figure in the community she had inadvertently transformed. She never asked for payment, deflecting any praise by saying she had simply been trying to keep her boy warm. Her name became synonymous not with folly, but with a revolutionary kind of common sense. The real impact of her innovation wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or cords of wood saved. It was measured in human lives. In the decade that followed, winter infant mortality in the valley, once tragically common, dropped to nearly zero. Families lived in their entire homes all winter long, no longer confined to a single smoky room. The quality of life, the simple human dignity of being warm and secure in the face of a brutal environment, was fundamentally altered. It was measured in the laughter of children who could play on the floor in January, a small miracle made possible by a woman who listened to the whispers of science from a world away. The story of Elara Vance and her hay-wrapped home is a powerful lesson. It speaks to the danger of conventional wisdom and the courage required to defy it. It reminds us that the most elegant solutions are often based on principles we overlook, and that knowledge from one discipline can unlock revolutionary progress in another. The arrogance of dismissing what we do not understand is a recurring theme in human history, but so is the quiet triumph of empirical proof. What Elara Vance created on that lonely patch of prairie was, in essence, a primitive version of what we now call a super-insulated or passive house. Modern building science has refined the materials, using high-tech foam panels, engineered air gaps, and sophisticated vapor barriers. But the core principle remains identical to the one her husband understood from insulating aircraft. Trap a thick layer of still air within a sealed envelope to achieve extraordinary thermal performance. The Vance method was proof that the fundamental laws of physics are accessible to anyone with an open mind and a pressing need to solve a problem. If this story of ingenuity has changed the way you think about the simple act of staying warm, hit that like button right now. Subscribe for more forgotten histories of incredible engineering, and drop a comment below telling us about the most clever, low-tech solution to a problem you've ever encountered. The narrative presented here is a fictionalized account intended for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physics principles of superinsulation, thermal breaks, and the insulating properties of trapped air are real and scientifically sound, the specific characters, names, and sequence of events are a composite creation. This content is based on historical concepts of frontier ingenuity, but does not represent a specific historical record, and should not be taken as professional construction advice.